The road smelled like rain before the rain came. I noticed it first. That particular heaviness in the air, the way the wind shifted direction and carried with it the cold breath of the river below the ridge. Growing up in Ashford's Mill, you learned to read the sky the way others read parchment. Clouds like bruised wool pressing low against the hills meant the Greystone Bridge would flood by nightfall. And if the bridge flooded, travelers wouldn't know until they were already in the middle of it, boards groaning beneath their horses, the current pulling at the timber supports like greedy hands. I had crossed it myself that morning, just after dawn, when it was still passable, barely. The center plank had cracked under my cart's left wheel, and I'd held my breath until I was safely on the other side, heart hammering against my ribs like it wanted to leave without me. By the time I turned back toward the village with my empty baskets, the sky had darkened considerably. The herbs I'd gathered weren't worth a life. That was what I told myself as I turned around on the narrow path and walked back toward the ridge road, intending to place a warning marker at the fork before heading home. It was the kind of thing no one would thank me for. No one ever did. In Ashford's Mill, I was simply Willa, the healer's apprentice, the quiet one who talked too much when she was nervous, and not enough when it mattered. The girl whose mother had left and whose father had stayed only long enough to make her feel the weight of being unwanted, before he too disappeared into a bottle and then into a grave. I was 23 years old, and I had made peace with the fact that I was largely invisible to the world, which was why I nearly walked directly into the horse. It was a magnificent animal, black as coal dust, enormous, with a kind of restrained power in every muscle that made it seem barely contained. It had stopped on the road ahead of me, and the man upon its back had not yet noticed me, because he was looking southward, toward the distant glimmer of the river cutting through the valley below. There were 3 other riders behind him, each on horses nearly as fine, but my eyes kept returning to the man in front. He wore no colors I recognized, no lord's crest I'd ever seen from the traveling merchants who passed through our village. But there was something in the way he held himself that made the air around him feel different, denser, like the atmosphere itself was paying attention. He was broad-shouldered in a way that seemed born rather than built, with dark hair cut short enough to show the line of his jaw, which was set with the kind of quiet authority that didn't need a crown to announce itself. A heavy cloak the color of midnight was pinned at one shoulder with something silver, and beneath it, he wore riding armor. Dark leather reinforced with iron at the joints, worn with the ease of a man who had never known how to be without it. His eyes, when they finally moved from the valley below and landed on me, were the color of winter water, gray and deep and utterly unreadable. I stopped walking. He didn't speak. He simply watched me the way a hawk watches something below, not with cruelty, but with complete and total attention, as though I were the only thing worth looking at in this entire stretch of road. It was deeply unnerving. "The bridge is broken," I said. It came out far more directly than I intended. I'd meant to explain the flooding, the cracked plank, the sound it had made beneath my cart, but instead, I had simply announced it like a fact, the way you might say the sky is gray or the fire is out. The man's expression didn't change. One of the riders behind him shifted, a tall man with red hair and a soldier's posture, his hand moving instinctively toward his sword hilt before he stopped himself. "She's speaking to you, he began. "I heard her," the man in front said. His voice was low, and it carried the kind of quiet that fills a room rather than leaving it empty. He looked at me for a long moment, then, "How broken?" I swallowed. There was something about being the sole focus of that gaze that made the inside of my chest feel strangely overcrowded. "The center plank is cracked through," I said, finding my footing in practicality. "I crossed it this morning and it held, but the river is rising. The rain hasn't reached the valley yet, but it will by sunset. The supports on the eastern side have been weakening for 2 seasons, If a horse that size, I glanced at his animal without meaning to, puts full weight on the center, the plank will give. The drop into the Greystone River from that height. I paused. It would not be survived. The silence that followed was not empty. It was the kind of silence that meant he was thinking, and thinking seriously. "Is there another crossing?" he asked. 3 miles north. There's a ford," I said. "It's shallow enough to cross on horseback. Even in rain. The water comes to the knee." I hesitated, then added, "It adds time, but you'll arrive." He looked at me for another long moment, not studying me the way men sometimes did, measuring, categorizing, dismissing, but something more careful than that. As though he were deciding whether I was telling the truth, and finding, somewhat to his own surprise, that I was. 3 miles north, he repeated. "Yes, follow the road past the split oak. You'll know it. It was struck by lightning some years back, and the two halves both survived. Turn left at the stone marker carved with a fish. The ford is a 1/4 mile past it." The red-haired rider behind him had stopped looking hostile, and was now looking at me with something closer to surprise. The man on the black horse inclined his head, not deeply, not the bow of a lesser man to a higher one, but a gesture of genuine acknowledgement, the kind that meant I received what you gave me. It was oddly dignified. "My thanks," he said. And then, because I was nervous, and because I always said more than necessary when I was nervous, I added, "The ford is cold, but cold is better than the alternative." Something moved at the corner of his mouth. Not quite a smile, more the possibility of one, contained before it fully arrived. He turned his horse northward without another word, and the 3 riders followed. I stood in the middle of the road and watched them go, feeling the particular smallness of being left behind by something that had briefly, completely, occupied all the space around me. The rain began to fall. I pulled my cloak tighter and walked home, thinking nothing of it, or trying very hard to think nothing of it, which is a different thing entirely. I would not have recognized him. I had never seen him. I knew the name the same way every soul in the kingdom knew it. The same way you know the name of a storm before it arrives. King Ronan of Kyrath. I did not know that was who I had just directed to a river ford. I did not know that in 3 days, a royal messenger would arrive in Ashford's Mill asking questions. I did not know that the man on the black horse had been watching the road for that ford marker long after my instructions should have ended. Or that the red-haired rider would later tell me he'd never seen the king thank a commoner on a roadside before. I only knew the rain was cold, and that something had shifted in the ordinary fabric of my afternoon in a way I couldn't name yet. I went home. I hung my cloak by the fire, and I thought about winter-gray eyes far longer than made any sense. Word count. 1, 312. I'm at 312 words and need to reach 802,000. Let me continue block 1 to full length. The village of Ashford's Mill sat at the bottom of a gentle slope between 2 hills, close enough to the river to use its mills, but far enough from the banks that flooding rarely troubled us. It was not a prosperous place, but it was not a desperate one either. We had a blacksmith, a baker, 2 taverns, a small sept for prayers, and Master Edric's apothecary where I had worked since I was 16. Master Edric was 70 years old, and moved like a man who had spent a lifetime making peace with inconvenience. He had taken me on not out of charity, he always said, but out of self-interest. His hands had begun to tremble, and he needed someone with steady fingers to prepare the finer compounds. I had steady fingers. I also had a memory that held plant names and their properties the way a dry cloth holds water, completely and without effort. He was the closest thing I had to family. When I arrived home that evening, damp and trailing mud onto the stone floor of the apothecary's back room where I lived, he was already asleep in his chair by the fire, a book open across his knee and his chin resting on his chest. I built up the fire quietly and began laying out my gathered herbs to dry: yarrow, lady's mantle, a handful of dried motherwort, and tried not to think about the man on the black horse. I failed at that immediately. There had been something in the way he'd asked how broken, not dismissing my warning, not humoring it, but taking it with the full weight of a serious man receiving serious information. I had warned lords before. In the years I'd traveled the Ridge Road on Edric's behalf, most of them looked through me like I was made of smoke. One had told me women didn't understand engineering. Another had tossed me a coin like I was begging. This man had asked a follow-up question. It was, I realized, an absurdly small thing to be thinking about. I ground the yarrow in the stone mortar until it released its sharp, grassy scent and forced my mind back to the work in front of me. Outside, the rain intensified, hammering the wooden shutters and turning the unpaved lane behind the apothecary into a shallow river of mud. By morning, the Greystone would be impassable. I had been right about that at least. I went to bed telling myself the whole encounter meant nothing. I woke at dawn to the sound of horses. Not one or two. Many. The kind of hoofbeats that meant a retinue, a company, a purpose. I sat up in my narrow bed with my heart already ahead of my thoughts, crossed to the window and looked out through the shuttered gap at the lane below. A rider in dark livery was speaking to Oswin, the baker, who was pointing down the lane. Pointing, I realized with a strange tightening in my chest, toward the apothecary. Master Edric, I told myself. They want a healer. Someone is hurt. I dressed quickly, pulling my hair into a practical knot, and went downstairs. The knock came before I reached the door. The man outside was not injured. He was young, perhaps 20, with the rigid posture of someone trained to deliver messages without showing what he thought about them. He wore a crest I didn't recognize, or thought I didn't, until I looked more carefully at the silver pin at his collar. A wolf with a crown above it. Clean lines. Old authority. "Are you called Willa?" he asked. "The healer's apprentice of Ashford's Mill?" Something cold moved through me that had nothing to do with the morning air. "I am," I said carefully. "You are requested," he said. "At the Carath garrison camp, 2 miles east on the King's Road. His Majesty's steward wishes to speak with you." The silence that followed was enormous. "His Majesty?" I repeated. "King Ronan of Carath," the messenger confirmed, as though I might have meant some other majesty. I looked past him at the lane. There were 6 riders behind him, waiting without impatience, without hostility, without any expression at all. The kind of patience that belonged to men accustomed to waiting on matters of consequence. I thought of winter gray eyes. I thought of 3 miles north. I thought, very clearly, "Oh, I'll need a moment," I told the messenger, and closed the door. I stood in the apothecary's front room with my back against the door, and breathed. Master Edric appeared from the hallway, pulling his robe closed, his white hair disordered from sleep. He looked at my face and then at the door, and back at my face. "Who's outside?" he asked. "A royal messenger," I said. "From the king." Edric blinked. "Which king?" "There's only one," I said faintly. He went to the window, looked out, and turned back to me with an expression I had never seen on him before, a mixture of alarm and something that might, in a different light, have been excitement. "Willa," he said slowly. "What did you do?" "I told a stranger about the bridge," I said. He stared at me. "That's all," I added. "I warned him about the bridge." Edric looked back out of the window. Then he looked at me. Then he crossed the room, took my hands in his trembling ones, and held them firmly. "Then go," he said. "And be exactly what you are. Don't be more and don't be less." I looked at our joined hands, then at his face, then at the door. I went. The garrison camp was not what I expected. I had imagined something rough, tents staked into mud, soldiers sharpening blades around open fires. The general disorder of men camped far from comfort. What I found instead was organized with a precision that felt almost architectural. The tents were large and dark-colored, arranged in a deliberate pattern around a central space, with guards posted at measured intervals and horses tended by handlers who moved with quiet efficiency. There were no unnecessary sounds, no shouting, no dice games, no idle laughter. Everything here had a purpose, and every person in it seemed to know exactly what theirs was. It made me feel immediately and acutely purposeless. The messenger led me through the outer ring of tents, past soldiers who noted my presence without comment, their expressions professionally neutral. I was aware of my worn cloak, my village boots still carrying yesterday's mud at the heel, my hair pinned up with less care than I'd have liked given the circumstances. I was aware of all of it in the specific, exhausting way that people who have always been at the bottom of a hierarchy learn to be aware. The constant low hum of, "I do not belong here" that you carry so long it starts to feel like your own heartbeat. I kept my chin level anyway. Edric had told me to be exactly what I was. I could manage that, I thought. Being exactly what I was had never required much imagination. The steward who came to meet me was a lean man of perhaps 50, with close-cropped gray hair and the careful eyes of someone whose profession required reading people quickly. He introduced himself as Aldrich, and he looked me over with an assessment that was thorough but not unkind. "You are the woman from the Ridge Road," he said. It was not a question. "I am," I said. "You warned His Majesty of the bridge condition." "I warned a traveler," I said. I didn't know who he was. Something shifted in Aldrich's expression. Not disapproval, but recalibration, as though my answer had landed slightly differently than expected. "His Majesty is aware of that," he said. "He wishes to speak with you directly." The words settled over me like cold water. "With me," I said. "With you," Aldrich confirmed, and nothing in his voice suggested this was anything other than a perfectly ordinary occurrence. He led me to the largest tent at the camp's center. 2 guards stood at its entrance, armored and still as carved figures, and neither of them looked at me as Aldrich lifted the heavy canvas flap and gestured me inside. The interior was larger than it appeared from outside. The canvas walls were hung with dark fabric that absorbed the gray morning light and threw the space into warm shadow, lit by iron braziers at each corner. There was a long table covered in maps, weighted at the corners with stones, and several camp chairs arranged without particular formality. A travel chest sat open near the far wall, organized with military precision. The man standing with his back to me, studying the largest of the maps, was the man from the road. He was without the heavy cloak now, wearing instead a dark linen tunic beneath a leather surcoat, worked with the same wolf and crown crest I'd seen on the messenger's pin. He was taller than I remembered, or the tent made him seem so. The red-haired rider stood a few feet to his right, arms crossed, and glanced at me when I entered with an expression that was almost amused. "The woman from the Ridge Road, Your Majesty," Aldrich announced quietly. Ronan turned. In daylight, even the muted, brazier-filtered light of a campaign tent, the full impact of him was harder to manage than it had been on the road. On the road, I had been operating on urgency and habit. Here, there was no urgency, and my habit of not looking directly at things that unsettled me was doing nothing useful. He studied me the way he had on the road, that same quality of complete attention, unhurried and unperformed. "You look less certain of yourself indoors," he said. I blinked. "I beg your pardon?" "On the road you spoke without hesitation." There was no criticism in it, merely observation, delivered with the directness of a man who had never learned to use words as decoration. I wondered if it would be different here. "I didn't know I was speaking to the king on the road," I said carefully. "Would it have changed what you said?" I considered lying. It would have been easier. It would have been the sensible, self-preserving answer. No, Your Majesty, of course not, delivered with a respectful lowering of the eyes. It might have changed how quickly I said it, I admitted instead. But not the content. The red-haired rider made a small sound that might have been a suppressed laugh. The king's expression did not change, but something in his eyes did. A fractional shift, like a door opening half an inch. "Sit," he said. I sat, because when a king uses that particular tone, it is not truly a request. He remained standing, which ought to have felt like a power dynamic and probably was meant to, though I had the odd sense he simply preferred being on his feet. He moved around the end of the table, not pacing. Kings didn't pace, or at least this one didn't, but repositioning with the deliberate ease of a man who was always thinking and preferred to think while moving. "The Greystone Bridge," he said. "You said its eastern supports have been weakening for 2 seasons. "Yes." "How do you know that?" "I cross it regularly," I said. "I gather medicinal plants on the ridge. I've watched the supports settle over time. The stone on the eastern side has an older foundation. I'm not an engineer, but I have eyes." "And common sense," the red-haired man said, and this time he didn't bother to suppress it. "Caius?" Ronan said, without inflection. "Apologies," Caius said, not sounding sorry at all. Ronan looked at me. "The bridge is a royal road. Its maintenance falls to the crown, not the village." "I know," I said. "Then you also know that if what you described is accurate, if the structure is as compromised as you believe, there should have been a report filed through the village headman to the regional lord months ago." I said nothing, because there was nothing to say that wouldn't be the kind of thing you weren't supposed to say in front of a king. Our headman, Corbin, was a comfortable man with a talent for not noticing problems that cost money to solve. Ronan seemed to read my silence as fluently as words. "It was not reported," he said. "It was not a question." "Not to my knowledge," I said carefully. He nodded once, slowly, the way people nod when they receive information that confirms something they already suspected and are not pleased to have confirmed. "Are you trained as a healer?" he asked, shifting direction without warning. "Apprenticed," I said. "To Master Edric, the apothecary of Ashford's Mill. 7 years. And before that? I grew up in the village." I paused. "There's not much before that worth mentioning." He looked at me for a moment in that way he had, as though he were considering whether to press the point and deciding against it, not because the point wasn't worth pressing, but because he respected that I'd drawn a line. "My healer was injured in a skirmish 4 days past," he said. "Nothing fatal, but the wound has not responded as expected to treatment. We carry field supplies, but no one in my company has the specific knowledge Aldrich believes the injury requires." I straightened slightly. This I understood. This was the part of the room where I knew how to stand. "What is the nature of the wound?" I asked. "A blade wound to the forearm, deep enough to require binding. The flesh around it has developed a heat and a color that concerns us." "Purpling? Or red?" He paused, surprised perhaps at the precision of the question. "Red at the edges, darkening toward the center." "Has it discharged anything?" "Aldrich," Ronan said. The steward stepped forward and described the wound's progression with the clinical clarity of a man who'd seen enough injuries to report them without flinching. I listened carefully, asking 3 more questions, turning the information over in my mind like a stone I was checking for weight. "It's not advancing corruption," I said when he finished. "Not yet. But the wound was bound too tightly, and the blood isn't moving through the flesh properly. Combined with whatever was on the blade, forest debris likely, the tissue is inflamed. It needs to be opened, cleaned with yarrow and honey, and rebound looser with a poultice of plantain leaf." I paused. "I have yarrow. I gathered it yesterday. I can prepare the compound here if you have the other materials." Ronan looked at me for a long moment. "You're certain?" he said. Certain enough that I'd stake my work on it, I said. Which I suppose I am. This time the corner of his mouth moved unmistakably. Not a full smile, not yet, but the clear impression that one was somewhere in the architecture of his face, waiting for sufficient cause to appear. Then we'll give you what you need, he said. It took me 3 hours. Caius, the red-haired rider, stayed in the tent and watched me work with an interest that started as surveillance and gradually relaxed into something more like genuine curiosity. The injured healer, a quiet woman named Sarah, perhaps 40, with a stoic practicality I immediately respected, accepted my treatment without complaint, and asked 3 intelligent questions about the plantain preparation that told me she knew enough to evaluate whether I was competent. I must have passed some invisible assessment, because by the time I finished binding the wound in the correct tension, she looked at me and said, "You were right about the binding." "I usually am about wounds," I said. "I'm wrong about other things constantly, but wounds I understand." She smiled at that, small and real. When I emerged from the tent, the afternoon had arrived without my noticing. The camp had continued its precise, purposeful activity around me, and I felt oddly suspended in time, as though the morning in which I had been Willa the invisible apprentice from Ashford's mill had belonged to someone else. Ronan was outside, speaking with 2 men I hadn't seen before. Older, armed, bearing themselves with the specific gravity of men who had been in many rooms where decisions were made. He glanced at me as I emerged and broke off the conversation with a word. "The healer?" "She'll be well," I said. "The poultice needs changing at dawn and midday for 3 days. I can write the instructions for whoever." "You'll return tomorrow," he said. It was not a question. I looked at him. He looked back. "You're asking me," I said slowly, "to return to a royal garrison camp to treat a patient." "I am," he said. "You have soldiers and attendants and—" "None of whom," he said, "know what you know." The wind moved between us, carrying the smell of wood smoke and distant rain. I thought of Edric. I thought of Ashford's mill. I thought of the way Sarah had looked at me when I finished. Not with gratitude exactly, but with the specific recognition of one practitioner for another. "Dawn," I said. "I'll come at dawn." He nodded once. I walked back through the camp, through the careful arrangement of tents and horses and purposeful men, and I did not look back. But I was aware, the entire way to the perimeter, of the precise sensation of being watched. I returned at dawn, as promised. And then the day after that, and the day after that. By the 4th morning, the guards at the camp's outer perimeter nodded when they saw me coming up the King's Road with my basket, and that small acknowledgement, barely a gesture, barely anything, settled something uncomfortable in my chest in a way I couldn't fully explain. I had spent so many years being looked through that being seen, even by soldiers whose names I didn't know, felt like a language I was only beginning to learn. Sarah improved steadily. By the 3rd day, the redness had retreated to a thin line at the wound's edge, and by the 4th, she was sitting up and eating, with the appetite of someone whose body had decided to cooperate again. She was not effusive. She was the kind of woman who expressed satisfaction through competence rather than words. But on that 4th morning, she watched me change the dressing and said quietly, "Where did you learn the plantain preparation? Edric's method or something older?" "Older," I said. "There's a manuscript in Edric's collection, not his own writing, something copied from a southern healer's notes. The proportions are different from the standard method." "Better," she said. "Significantly," I agreed. We worked in companionable silence after that, and I realized I was comfortable in a way I hadn't expected to be. In a royal garrison camp, tending to the king's healer, surrounded by soldiers and attendants, and the low, constant hum of a military operation in motion. Comfort in unusual places was perhaps something I was better at than I'd known. Ronan came to the healer's tent each morning, always briefly, always with a specific question, about Sarah's progress, about the materials I needed, once about whether I thought a different binding technique might be useful for field injuries generally. The questions were practical, and he listened to the answers with the full attention he seemed to give everything. And then he left, and I told myself very firmly that I did not notice when he was no longer in the room. Caius, Sir Caius, I had learned, the king's first sword and closest companion since childhood, was less restrained about his interest in me. On the third day, he positioned himself on a camp stool near the tent entrance, while I worked and watched with the particular energy of someone who had decided I was interesting and wasn't embarrassed about it. "How long have you lived in Ashford's Mill?" he asked. "All my life," I said, not looking up from my preparation. "And you've never thought of leaving?" "Thought of it," I said. "Thinking doesn't cost anything." He smiled. He had one of those faces that smiled easily and often, which was a striking contrast to Ronan, who seemed to portion smiles out like something finite. "What stopped you?" I considered the question honestly, the way you do when someone asks something real, and you realize the automatic answer and the true answer aren't the same. "Edric," I said. "He needed me. And I needed somewhere to be needed." Caius was quiet for a moment, and when I glanced at him his expression had changed slightly. Not pitying, which I couldn't have borne, but thoughtful in a way that felt respectful. "The king doesn't need people," he said, almost to himself. "Not in the way you mean. He needs capable people. Advisors, soldiers, strategists. But needing in the way where absence is felt." He stopped. "I've been with him since we were boys. I've seen him need that precisely once." I looked up at him then. He met my eyes and seemed to realize he'd said more than he intended. "You're good with that compound," he said, pivoting without grace. "You're not good at subtlety," I replied. He laughed, genuine and sudden, the kind of laugh that comes out before you decide to let it. "No. Ronan always says that. He's right, but it would be very annoying to tell him so." I smiled despite myself. It was on the 5th day that things changed. I arrived at the camp to find a different energy in the air. Tighter, the soldiers moving with more purpose, conversations stopping and resuming in lower registers. Aldrich met me at the perimeter rather than the usual junior messenger, and his expression carried the careful neutrality of a man delivering information he wasn't certain how the recipient would take. "There are visitors," he said. "They arrived last night. Lords of the Northern Compact, 3 of them, with their retinues. They've been requesting an audience since before dawn." "That doesn't concern my work," I said carefully. "It may," Aldrich said. "They know you've been attending to the king's healer. One of them has made comments." He paused. "Lord Varen, in particular." I filed the name away. "What kind of comments?" Aldrich pressed his lips together briefly. "The kind that question the wisdom of allowing a village woman repeated access to the royal camp." I stood with that for a moment. I had expected something like it, had been aware, distantly, that my continued presence here was unusual enough to attract attention. I simply hadn't expected it to happen quite yet. "I see," I said. "His Majesty is aware," Aldrich said. "He asked that I inform you directly." That surprised me. "He told you to warn me?" "He told me to ensure you had full information before entering the camp today." The phrasing was his. I thought about that, about the particular care it represented, the deliberateness of it. Ronan had thought about how this news would land for me, and had made a decision about how I should receive it. It was the kind of consideration that arrived without announcement, and it struck me somewhere unguarded. "I'll come in," I said. The Lords of the Northern Compact were visible from across the camp, not because they were loud, but because they carried themselves with the particular volume of men who believe their presence is itself an argument. Lord Varen was the most prominent, heavy-set, silver-haired, wearing furs that probably cost more than Ashford's mill earned in a season. He stood near the central tent, with 2 younger lords flanking him, and watched me cross the camp with the expression of a man looking at something he didn't consider worth the bother of looking at. I had seen that expression before. It had never stopped being unpleasant. I went to the healer's tent and worked, and tried not to think about the conversation happening 30 feet away on the other side of canvas. I failed at that too. The voices were not quite audible as words, but the textures were clear enough. Varen's carrying bass, the measured lower register that I had come to identify as Ronan's even when I couldn't hear the content. Then Caius, once, sharper. Then Ronan again. And whatever he said ended that particular thread of conversation with the finality of a door being closed. Sarah watched my face while I worked. "Don't let Varen trouble you," she said eventually. "He troubles everyone. It's his primary contribution." Does he listen to Varen's counsel?" I asked, aiming for detachment and missing by some distance. "The king listens to everyone," Sarah said. "And then he decides what he thinks. The 2 activities are not always connected." I rewrapped her arm carefully, checking the tension the way she'd taught me to check mine, 3 fingers between cloth and skin. No more, no less. "You're nearly healed," I said. "Another 2 days, and you won't need me." She looked at her arm, then at me. "Is that what you think I've needed you for?" I didn't know what to say to that. She settled back against her pillow. "Willa, I have been with this company for 6 years. In that time, I have seen the king receive reports, execute strategy, conduct diplomacy, govern from a tent when necessary, and from a great hall when not. I have seen him be every kind of king that circumstances required." She paused. "I have not seen him walk to the perimeter of his own camp to watch someone leave." The sentence arrived and sat there. "He likely had reason," I said. "Something to see to, near the—" "He stood at the perimeter," Sarah said, gently and precisely, "and watched until you were out of sight. Then he went back to work." I looked at my hands. "I'm a village healer's apprentice," I said, "from a place he'll never visit again." "He's visited it 4 times in 5 days," Sarah said. "The garrison camp is 2 miles from your village." I had no answer to that. I gathered my materials and stepped out of the tent into the pale afternoon, and found Ronan standing not far from the entrance, not waiting, or at least doing a convincing impression of a man who was simply there and not waiting. He had a folded document in his hand, and was reading it with the focused expression he brought to everything, and he looked up when I emerged with the natural timing of someone who had been aware of the tent entrance all along. "How is she?" he asked. "Almost fully recovered," I said. 2 more days at most." He nodded. A pause followed. Not uncomfortable, which was the strange thing about silences with Ronan. They never felt like gaps that needed filling. They felt like part of the conversation. "Lord Varen said something to you?" he said. Not a question. "Lord Varen said something about me," I corrected. "That's different." "Is it?" "It is to me," I said. "If it were to my face, I'd have had to respond to it. At a distance, I can choose not to hear it." He considered that. "And do you choose not to hear it?" I met his eyes. The winter gray, steady and direct, looking at me the way they always did, like I was worth looking at squarely. "I hear it," I admitted. "I simply don't let it determine where I stand." The afternoon light moved across the camp, long and golden, the kind of light that made even military canvas look briefly beautiful. Somewhere in the outer ring, a horse was being walked in slow circles, its hoofbeats a steady rhythm against the packed earth. Ronan looked at me for a moment that lasted longer than most moments. "There's a feast tonight," he said, "for the Northern Lords. A formality." He paused, and the pause had weight in it. "I want you to attend." The request, and it was a request this time, not an instruction. I could hear the difference, landed with the force of something much larger than a feast invitation. "As what?" I asked. Not defensive, genuinely needing to understand. "As someone I have invited," he said simply. "That is sufficient explanation." I thought of Lord Varen's expression across the camp. I thought of Edric telling me to be exactly what I was. I thought of winter-gray eyes watching the road. "I'll need to go home first," I said. "I don't have anything suitable." "Aldrich will arrange something," Ronan said, and the certainty in it, the simple, unflashy certainty that this would be handled and I need not worry, did something strange and warm to the inside of my chest. I nodded. He went back to his document. I walked toward the perimeter, and if I was aware the entire time of the possibility that someone was watching, I chose, deliberately, not to turn around and check. Some things are better carried as possibility than confirmed. The gown Aldrich arranged was the color of deep water, a blue so dark it was almost black in shadow, shifting to something richer in firelight. It was simple in construction, which I appreciated, made of a fabric finer than anything I had ever worn, but without the excessive ornamentation that would have made me feel like a costume, rather than a person. A serving woman whose name was Bet helped me dress in one of the camp's private tents, and did something careful with my hair, pinning it partly up, leaving some loose. And when she stepped back and looked at me with professional satisfaction, I looked down at myself and felt the particular strangeness of occupying a version of yourself you hadn't previously known existed. "You have good bones," Bet said approvingly, which I gathered was a compliment. "Thank you," I said, uncertain how else to receive that. She handed me a small, polished piece of metal to use as a mirror. I looked at my own face in it. The same face I'd always had, the unremarkable brown eyes, the nose that had been broken once in childhood when I fell from a mill roof and healed slightly crooked, the mouth that was too ready with words and not ready enough with the right ones. Nothing had changed about the face, but the woman wearing it seemed somehow less invisible than she had been yesterday. I put the metal down. The feast was held in an expanded central tent, its walls rolled back on one side to open onto the camp's main clearing, where fire pits burned and the evening air carried wood smoke and the smell of roasting meat. Long trestle tables had been arranged with more formality than a campaign camp had any right to produce. Clean linen, iron candle holders, proper cups rather than field vessels. The Northern Lords and their attendants were already assembled when Aldrich walked me in, and the particular quality of silence that descended when I entered was the kind I recognized, the silence of a room recalibrating. I kept my chin level. I found a place to stand near the edge of the gathering while Aldrich went to announce something to someone, and I stood there being exactly what I was. A village healer's apprentice in a borrowed gown, in a royal garrison, because a king had asked. Lord Varen found me within minutes. He was smoother about it than I'd expected, approaching with his cup in hand, his expression arranged into something that resembled pleasantness, if you didn't look at his eyes. "The healer's girl," he said, "from the village." "Willa?" I said. "Yes." "Extraordinary," he said, in a tone that meant the opposite. "His Majesty is generous with his hospitality." "He is," I agreed, refusing the bait. Varen's eyes moved over me with the particular appraisal of a man who categorizes people by usefulness and has already determined I am none. "You treated Sarah's wound, I understand. Admirable. A village skill that served its purpose." "It did," I said. "Though one imagines," he continued, his voice lowering slightly, "that the purpose has perhaps extended beyond the wound at this point. I looked at him directly. I imagine many things, I said. Most of them accurate. Something moved behind his eyes. Surprise, quickly suppressed. He had expected either deference or flustering, and I had given him neither. You're bold, he said, not a compliment. I'm clear, I said. There's a difference. He studied me for a moment with the expression of a man revising a threat assessment. Before he could respond, Caius materialized at my shoulder with the cheerful purposefulness of someone who had been watching and chose this exact moment to intervene. Lord Varen, he said warmly, the king was asking for you. Something about the Northern Road assessment. I believe he has questions about the Eastern Garrison reports. He smiled with complete friendliness. Best not to keep him waiting. Varen looked between us, settled his expression back into pleasantness, and withdrew. Caius turned to me, and his smile became something more genuine. You handled that well. You rescued me, I said. I redirected him, Caius corrected. You'd already handled it. I just removed the opportunity for a second approach. He handed me a cup, wine, deep red, warm from proximity to the fire pits. He'll make more trouble before this is over. Varen always does. But trouble from Varen means you're worth troubling, which is its own kind of recognition. I looked across the tent to where Ronan stood with the other two northern lords, listening to something one of them was saying with the focused patience of a man giving someone enough rope. He had changed into a formal tunic, dark, as everything he wore seemed to be, with silver at the collar, and the authority he carried quietly during the day was more visible here, in firelight and company, without becoming anything showy. It was simply who he was, power worn like a second skin, so habituated it had stopped being performance, as though he felt my attention, or perhaps he had simply been aware of me since I entered, the way I was aware of him. He looked across the room. Our eyes met. He held the contact for 3 seconds, 4, and then returned to the conversation he was in without apparent disruption, but the slight shift in his expression in that moment, something that was not quite a smile but was adjacent to warmth, stayed with me through the next half hour of navigating introductions and conversations, and the general exhausting exercise of being looked at and assessed by people who had decided my presence required explanation. I talked with Caius. I talked with 2 of the king's advisors, who were more curious than hostile, and a young lord from the east, who was less interested in my origins than in whether I'd ever encountered the river fever that had struck his village 2 seasons past. And I had, and we spent a quarter hour in genuine discussion about treatment methods that left us both in better standing than when we'd started. I was doing something that resembled being comfortable when Ronan came to stand beside me. He did not announce his arrival. He simply arrived, the way significant weather arrives. You feel it before you see it. The young Eastern Lord excused himself with visible and entirely understandable alacrity, and then it was just the 2 of us at the edge of the firelight, near enough to the open wall that the evening air moved past us, cool and smelling of wood smoke and pine from the hills. You're not what Varen expected, Ronan said. I'm not what most people expect, I said. It's one of the few advantages of being consistently underestimated. He looked at me sidelong. How long has that been true? I thought about the question, about the years of being invisible, of being the girl whose parents left and who stayed, and who made herself useful, and who took up as little space as possible so as not to remind people that she was there and unclaimed, and therefore uncomfortable to look at. Long enough that I stopped counting, I said. He was quiet for a moment. When Ronan was quiet, it was never absence. It was the opposite, a kind of concentrated presence, as though he brought more of himself to silence than most people brought to speech. I was underestimated once, he said, extensively, before the crown. I looked at him. He was watching the fire pits, his profile sharp in the light. What changed it? I asked. I stopped managing how people saw me, he said. I found it took too much energy that was better spent elsewhere. A pause. The ones worth having around adjusted, the ones who didn't. He left it there, unfinished, but the shape of the ending was clear enough. That works more easily when you're a king, I said quietly. Not with bitterness, simply as observation. It worked before, he said. The crown confirmed what was already decided. I turned to look at him fully, and he turned at the same moment, and we were closer than I'd realized. The narrowed space between two people who have been gradually orienting toward each other without consciously choosing to. I could see the firelight in his gray eyes, and the slight tension at the corner of his jaw that I had come to recognize as the expression he wore when he was thinking something he hadn't decided yet whether to say. He said it. I am returning to Karath in 3 days. The words fell into the evening air between us, and I felt the full weight of everything they contained. The ending of something that had barely had time to become itself, the reclosing of a world that had briefly, unexpectedly opened. I see, I said. My voice was steady. I was proud of that. The bridge will be assessed and repaired, he said. I have already given the orders. The headman of Ashford's Mill will receive a formal inquiry regarding the delayed report. He paused. These things would have happened regardless. I want that to be clear. I know, I said. And I did. I had never imagined I was the cause of his generosity. Only, perhaps, the occasion of it. What I am less certain of, he said, and the quality of his voice changed. Lower, more careful, more something. Is what happens to the rest of it. The rest of what? I asked, though something in me already knew. He looked at me without the armoring of careful neutrality he wore through the rest of his day. Just directly, honestly, with the slightly raw quality of a man who has spent so long managing everything that the moment of not managing is both relief and vulnerability at once. You know what I mean? He said. I did. I did know. I felt it in the same place I felt weather coming. The deep, atmospheric certainty of something larger than the current moment pressing in. I'm a village healer's apprentice, I said softly. You are, he agreed. And you warned a stranger about a bridge, and prepared a compound from a southern manuscript you found in an apothecary's collection, and stood in front of Lord Varen without flinching, and said cold is better than the alternative on a ridge road in the rain. He paused. These are not small things. They're very small things, I said. Not from where I was standing, he said. The fire crackled. Somewhere behind us a lute had begun playing, soft and unhurried, filling the tent with the kind of music that acknowledges the hour without demanding it be anything other than what it is. I don't know what you're asking, I said. It was not entirely true. But some things need to be spoken plainly before they become real. He reached out and touched the back of my hand. Just the briefest press of his fingers against mine. There and then not there. The lightest possible contact, but deliberate. Entirely deliberate. Come to Karath, he said. Not as a guest, not as a healer. Come as someone who is considering whether she belongs there. I looked at our hands, his no longer touching mine, but the warmth of it remaining. I looked at his face. I thought of Edric, of Ashford's Mill, of every morning I had crossed the ridge road alone and thought about leaving and stayed. 3 days, I said finally. 3 days, he agreed. I'll give you an answer before you leave. He nodded. One of the northern lords called his name from across the tent, and he straightened, the king returning to the surface of the man the way it always did, smooth and complete and immediate. But he looked at me once more before he turned. And what was in that look was neither a command nor a plea. It was simply an open door, held by someone who would not force the passage, but would stand there, patiently, for exactly as long as was needed. I stayed at the feast until the candles burned low. I spoke to more people than I'd expected to find interesting, and found them interesting anyway. I drank 1 cup of wine, and then water, and felt, for the first time in as long as I could honestly remember, like someone who occupied a room rather than apologized for being in it. Walking back to the perimeter under a sky thick with stars, Caius fell into step beside me without invitation. "You're thinking very hard about something," he observed. "Always," I said. He was quiet for a moment, which for Caius was an event. "He doesn't ask," he said. "In case you were wondering. He has never, in all the years I've known him, asked anyone to come to Kairath." A pause. "He arranges, he ensures, he provides. But he does not ask, because asking means it matters, and he doesn't allow things to matter easily." I walked without answering. "He asked you," Caius said simply. And then he fell back and let me walk alone to the edge of the camp, where the King's Road curved away toward Ashford's Mill, and the dark hills rose beyond it, and the stars were very still and very bright and full of things I hadn't yet decided. I went to Edric that night. He was awake, which didn't surprise me. He slept less and less these days, spending his evenings with his books and his fire, and the particular contentment of a man who has made peace with the shape of his life. He looked up when I came in, read my face the way he had always read it, and put the book down without being asked. I told him everything, not in the ordered way I might have presented a case for treatment, messily, the way truth comes when you've been holding it carefully for too long and finally set it down. The bridge, the road, the gray eyes, Sarah's wound, the feast. The open door held patiently by a man who did not ask for things easily. Edric listened without interrupting, which was his greatest gift. When I finished, the fire had settled lower, and the room smelled of old paper and dried herbs, and the particular safety of a place that has held you through everything. "What does your mind say?" he asked. "That it's impossible," I said. "That I'm a village apprentice, and he's a king, and this is the kind of story that doesn't belong to people like me." "And your instincts?" I looked at the fire. "That I have been standing still for someone else's reasons for a very long time," I said quietly, "and that the bridge I warned him about wasn't the only thing that needed crossing." Edric smiled, slow and real, the smile of a man who had known the answer before the question was finished. "Your hands are too skilled for me to keep them selfish," he said. "They never only belong to this village." He reached across and pressed my hand once, firmly. "Go, Willa. And don't make yourself smaller to fit through the door. Walk through it as you are." I left before dawn on the 3rd day. Kairath was nothing like I had imagined, and everything I should have expected. The castle rose from the landscape the way mountains rise, as though it had always been there, and the world had arranged itself respectfully around it. Dark stone, towers that caught the morning light and held it, walls that spoke of centuries of purpose. The city below it was alive with the sounds of a working kingdom. Blacksmiths and bakers and merchants and children, and the layered noise of 10,000 people going about the serious business of being alive. I arrived with the king's company, riding in a cart beside Sarah, who had recovered completely, and spent the journey teaching me 3 preparation methods I hadn't known, and asking me intelligent questions about 2 that I had. By the time we passed through the castle gates, I felt less like someone arriving and more like someone returning, which made no logical sense and was true nonetheless. Ronan met me in the courtyard. He had changed back into the full authority of his position, the formal bearing, the crown's weight implicit even without the crown itself. But when he looked at me crossing the courtyard toward him, something in his face did what it always did, simplified, became less managed, became just a man watching someone arrive and being glad of it. "You came," he said. "I said I'd give you an answer before you left," I said. "This is the answer." The corner of his mouth moved. All the way this time. A real smile, uncontained, arriving without reservation. It changed his whole face. It made him look like someone who had been waiting a long time to be allowed to be something other than inevitable. "It is," he agreed. "The months that followed were not simple. Nothing worth having ever is." Lord Varan made his objections loudly and formally, and was heard with the patience Ronan gave everything, and then overruled with a quiet finality that left no room for appeal. There were courtiers who looked at me the way Varan had, measuring, dismissing, and I looked back at them with the steadiness I had learned on ridge roads in the rain, and most of them eventually recalibrated. I worked beside Sarah, and then beyond Sarah, establishing a proper healing practice within the castle that served soldiers and servants and nobles with equal attention, because illness does not observe hierarchy, and I saw no reason to pretend otherwise. Ronan never asked me to be other than what I was. He seemed, in fact, to regard what I was with a consistency that gradually stopped surprising me and started simply feeling like being known. We were married in the castle's great hall in early spring, when the hills outside Kyarath were green and the river below the valley ran clear. Caius stood at Ronan's side and wept with the cheerful shamelessness of a man who saw no reason to hide it. Sarah stood at mine, dry-eyed and smiling, with the specific satisfaction of someone whose assessment had proved correct. Edric made the journey from Ashford's Mill. It took him 4 days, and he complained about every one of them, and arrived glowing with a happiness he didn't bother to disguise. I brought him to the castle's library that first evening, shelves upon shelves of manuscripts and records and collected knowledge, and watched his face when he understood the scope of it. He stood in the middle of it for a long moment, very still. "There's a Southern Healer's manuscript collection in the Eastern Wing," I told him. "I've already arranged for you to have access." He looked at me. His eyes were bright. "You planned this," he said. "I learned from you," I said. "You always said the work was the point." He took my hands in his trembling ones, the way he had on the morning the messenger came, and held them with the same firm certainty. "The work," he said softly, "and the people you do it beside." The Greystone Bridge was rebuilt that autumn, properly with new stone foundations on both sides, wide enough for 2 carts to pass. I rode out to see it completed on a gray morning that smelled like rain before the rain came, standing at its center and looking down at the water moving below, the same river I had watched from the ridge road all my life. Ronan came to stand beside me, having followed on horseback without announcement, the way he did many things, quietly, with purpose, without requiring recognition for it. We stood together at the bridge's center for a long moment. "This is where it started," I said. "A little north of here," he said. "At the fork." "Near enough," I said. He looked at me, the winter-gray eyes, steady and warm and direct, the look that had never once made me feel invisible. "Near enough," he agreed. The rain came, soft and unhurried, and we stayed until it passed, standing on solid ground, on a bridge that would hold, in a life that was entirely and completely ours. That was enough. That was everything. That was where the story ended, and where the living began.